So this morning, we'll be talking about silence and solitude, and I thought I would begin with a quote from Henry Nouwen, who is a French theologian who does a lot with disciplines and meditation and things along that nature. And he says that without solitude, it is virtually impossible to live a spiritual life. And I found myself kind of challenged by that thought because I don't know if you're like me, but whenever I see someone and they say something like the most important thing or without this you just can't do it, I immediately get kind of critical to it and start thinking, well, what about, or what about, or what about? And then I found myself drawn to Jesus and the way he lived and the things that he did. If you're in the auditorium class this morning, I kind of laughed to myself a little bit because I did not expect Jet in the topic he was dealing with to get to Herodias and John the Baptist of all places. And I told him as after class this morning, where he ended is exactly where we're starting, which is kind of neat. But within that story, to remind us, Herodias is offered whatever, and her selection is John the Baptist's head on a platter. That's what she wants to have. And so John the Baptist is killed because he is standing up for what is right, and he has rubbed people the wrong way because of that, kind of echoing some of Jack's thoughts from this morning about how different the world around us and their values are. It's not a new thing. It's obviously progressed over time, but even John the Baptist 2,000 years ago was dealing with that same kind of thing. And so within the context of that story, John the Baptist is killed, and then word of that gets to Jesus. So we'll remember all the way back from the beginning of the Gospels, John the Baptist is his cousin. He's kind of the predecessor that's sent along to spread the message that the Lamb of God is coming into the world. And so they are close both, within family and even within theological things. And Jesus gets word that he's killed, and you can imagine how most of us might feel in that moment to get news like that. And in Matthew chapter 14, as we consider the life of Jesus, Matthew says in verse 13, when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there on a boat to a desolate place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. So Jesus' idea is when he gets this word about John the Baptist, he just wants to get away. He doesn't want to be around a big group of people. He wants to have some quiet time alone and be able to pray, to be able to have some solitude, and yet the crowd presses in. And so as the crowd presses in, Jesus is met with kind of this, what do I do? Now we have, on the average day, a much lesser version of this a lot of times. Do you ever think to yourself, for those of you who work and have a busy job and you're around people a lot, if people would just leave me alone, I could get my job done. If people would stop coming in and asking me for things, I could finally get things done. I don't get just a ton of traffic. I have the very back office in the hallway back there. You've got to want to get to me back there. And I don't get a ton, but when I was taking classes on Zoom and things like that, I would have to put a sign on the door that says, Brian is in a Zoom meeting for the next 2 hours so that people wouldn't come knock and call and all that stuff during that time. And if there was an emergency, I get that. But for the most part, we have to kind of create these barriers for that. And Jesus, attempting to do that, still has the crowd press in. And what we find in the continuing part here of Matthew 14 is, rather than by himself, he finds himself in the midst of a crowd of 5,000 men and then some women and children too, and feeds them using these loaves and fish, does this incredible miracle. So even though he's trying to get away, he finds himself having compassion on the crowd and caring about them. So Jesus, he knows the importance of silence and solitude, and yet he also understands that sometimes you get interrupted from that. Now, for a lot of us, what we do at that point is we just give up on the silence and solitude. We've tried, we've put up the signs, we've told people not to disturb us in this moment, and they just keep coming in, and we just think, life is just too busy. And if you remember back to when we talked about meditation early on in all of this, the idea that the muchness and manyness, the busyness of our world is one of the biggest barriers between us and doing all the things that we've been talking about doing when it comes to disciplines. With silence and solitude, that is probably one of the worst. And so we find ourselves busy and yet in a need of silence and solitude. And I believe we can take from the example of Jesus here that even though the crowd presses in, even though the crowd wants what they need from him, and he feeds them and takes care of that, he still comes back to it. And so after he has fed the 5,000, in verse 22, it says, Immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. And so his objective here is two things. He's blessing them with the silence and solitude that they need, and at the same time finding some for himself. So after he had dismissed the crowd, in verse 23, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray, and when evening came, he was there alone. So finally, after the hard news of the early part of the day and all of the activity and the miraculous things in the crowds of the middle of the day, here he finally finds himself alone. It's interesting to me that Jesus doesn't take the crowd as an excuse to just give up on this. The feeding of the 5,000 did not change his original need. And so if you have come into your day with a need for some silence, a need for some solitude, a need for some peace in life, and then everything gets really busy, don't forget there's still a need for that. Don't forget that there is still this thing that God has built within you that says, I need time alone. And even the most extroverted among us needs some time alone, needs time in silence and solitude. So this, in the life of Jesus, is not a single event. I find myself drawn to this one every time I think about this topic, but it's not like this is the only time this happened. Especially when you look through Mark's gospel, it's all over the place. You will find Jesus in the midst of difficult things or just journeying along or just a random event of the day, going off by himself, having some silence, having prayer, whatever it is that he did. In Luke's gospel, he describes it this way. Luke early on records some miracles and things he's done, and Jesus is getting more and more popular, more people are seeking him out. And in chapter 5, Luke says, now even more the report about him went abroad, and great crowds gathered to hear him and to be healed of their infirmities, but he would withdraw to desolate places and pray. And if you were to look at the Greek of the verbs within this sentence, what you find is it is an ongoing action. This is something he would do. It was a habit of his to do. So Jesus took time to pray all the time, took time to get away and be in silence and solitude frequently. Silence and solitude were regular practices for Jesus. And I think if Jesus were the one here talking about spiritual disciplines for the last several weeks, which would be great, by the way, I'd just sit and listen to that. But if he were the one here talking, he may have led with silence and solitude because it seems so core to who he is and how he lived. So why are they important? If Jesus did it so frequently, I think one of the things we can obviously infer from that is it has to be important. If Jesus, who could perfectly balance everything, if Jesus was one who walked the earth and you would never say to Jesus, Jesus, you really need to get your priorities straight. You know, he's got that. He knows what's most important and what's least, and he kept taking so much time, regardless of situation, for it. It clearly is important. So why is it important to us? Why is it important that we have silence and solitude? Now, first of all, and maybe this is the obvious one, life weighs us down. We come here weekly for the purpose of worshiping God primarily, for the purpose of remembering what he did for us in the Lord's Supper, maybe to hear from his word or to sing to him, whatever we may do. It's difficult for us in the midst of all that to let go of everything else, isn't it? I have things weighing on my mind this morning, and I will tell you that even though I was getting up here to talk about silence and solitude, there has already been a couple moments where the things weighing on my mind came back to me. I wasn't fully focused on what we were doing. I wasn't fully there. I find myself drawn to whatever those things are. And I would imagine I'm not alone. There are things where you struggle with those things that are happening in life that you can't ignore. Life weighs us down. In Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verse 23, the wise man says, "For all his days are full of sorrow, and his work is a vexation. Even in the night his heart does not rest. This is also vanity." Do you have days that feel like that? It feels like everything about your day is it just bears you down. And then you go home and you have a hard time letting loose of it while you're there. And maybe you have had moments where you've taken that out on your spouse or on your kids because you're frustrated from work. And it takes you a minute to get out of that and realize, oh, actually, I'm not mad at these people. These are the people that I love. It's those people at work that are driving me nuts right now, and I don't know what to do and how to let go. And then you try to get to sleep, and you struggle getting to sleep because it's still on your mind. And then somewhere in the middle of the night, you wake up, and you have dreamt about it. And you have dreamt about all that stuff that is weighing you down. And then you wake up in the morning, and we asked the question a week or two ago, What's the first thing on your mind in the morning when you get up? And it's that again. You are weighed down by all these things of life. Or in the New Testament, Jesus says this, watch yourselves, lest your hearts be weighed down with dissipation and drunkenness and cares of this life, and that day come upon you suddenly like a trap. Jesus warns us because he understands these things can weigh us down so much that it is difficult to see anything else. And so for us, those moments of silence and solitude are a way of battling back against the things that weigh us down. Secondly, God has designed us with a need for this. If you feel like you're just running ragged all the time and there is never any time just to get away, that's natural. You were not designed to just constantly go and constantly go. And we get that with other things of life, don't we? If you're just to use things constantly all the time, eventually they wear out. And at some point you have to replace them. And depending on the thing and how it's built and how delicate it is, sometimes that happens sooner than others. For us, we are designed in the way that we are just going to wear out if we don't take time for Sabbath, time for rest, time for silence. In Lamentations 3, verses 25 and 26, we read, "The Lord is good to those who wait for him, to the soul who seeks him. It is good that one should wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord." How often do we wait quietly for anything anymore? If you're standing in a line, you don't just stand on the line. You're on your phone. You might have your AirPods in, listening to something. There's always other things that are going on. How often are we able to just sit and be silent? Or the psalmist in Psalm 23, verses 1 and 2 says, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures." Why? Because you're not going to do it on your own. He makes me lie down. He leads me beside still waters. So there is this image of vision, this image and vision of peace and quiet in a place that is just restful. He makes us have places like that. Third, we need renewal and we need restoration. Do you ever have those moments in life where everything is just running so fast and so quickly that you just have to step back and breathe? Have you ever, we're getting toward the end of summer here, have you gone on any summer vacations that were not all that restful this summer? You know, if you find yourself in a place and you're there and it's busy and you're just doing and doing and doing, and you get home and it's like you can finally just take a breath from the vacation that was supposed to have been the restful thing. We are built with this need to be renewed and to be restored, and the place that comes from is God. In Isaiah 40, verses 29 through 31, Isaiah says he gives power to the faint, and to him who has no might, he increases strength. Even youths shall faint and be weary, and young men shall feel exhausted. But they who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. Doesn't that sound great? I will tell you, it was the weirdest thing. After buying school supplies literally from about 12:30 to 5 on Friday, I had to make multiple trips because I kept filling my car up. And I was tired at the end of the day. I didn't know shopping could make somebody that tired. And carrying school supplies around, and I felt just kind of faint and weary. We have times like that where it's physically that or mentally that, and God says he is the one who renews. He's the one who gives us strength. Fourth, Jesus commanded these things. And if nothing else on the list has clicked with you, I hope this does. There are a lot of things Jesus does by example. There are a lot of things that he just mentions or reiterates things from the Old Testament or whatever it may be. But he actually commands his disciples to have quiet time, to have solitude. In Mark chapter 6, verses 30 and 31, the disciples have come back from being sent out, and they're giving the report on all of the things that they've done. It says the apostles returned to Jesus, and they told him all they'd done and taught. And he said to them, "Come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest a while. You have worked hard, you have done well. Now come away and you need rest. You need a place to yourselves." For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. And we have those moments too, do we not? You ever have a long work day and you get to about 4 o'clock and realize, I forgot to eat lunch today. We get so busy even we forget to eat at times. In verse 32, after being told, and by the way, they're in verse 30 and 31, the verbs that Jesus uses, they are command verbs, they're imperatives. He's not saying, maybe you should try this. He's saying, you go do this. And then verse 32, they went away. in a boat to a desolate place by themselves. So if you're a fisherman here, it's biblical. You can go out in a boat by yourself, and that's actually a command of, try using that next time. It's a command of Jesus that you go out and you have this desolate place. For the hunters that want to be up in a deer stand somewhere, this is a biblical idea that there is a need for these times of renewal. And for the non-sports folks among us, there are other ways to go about it too, but they went away and they did this. Fifth, they help us see God more clearly. Now, there's so much of this that is the need for within us and all of that. There's so much of this that's the need for renewal, the need to slow down, the need to have silence and quiet. But there is also something beneficial in that it's hard sometimes, even though God is so obvious within our world, sometimes we miss Him. Sometimes things get so busy and so loud, we forget what He's doing. And you have probably had those moments, haven't you? We've had moments where we've been out on the beach and the waves have been coming in, not Gulf Shores at spring break. You can't think about anything at that moment. But if you're ever out there at a weird time and you're kind of by yourself and no one else is there, it is hard not to recognize who God is in that moment. If you were catching an Oklahoma sunset on the right day, it is hard to not recognize who God is within that moment. They help us see God more clearly. The psalmist in Psalm 46, verses 10 and 11, says, "Be still and know that I am God." So how do we know that He is God? It begins with stillness. We have to be willing to stop all the activity and be still. "I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress." And we get very caught up on the be still and know because it's one of those songs that we sing and almost forget in the second part of this, "I will be exalted in the earth." When we are still and recognize that He is God, He is known. He is known within the earth. And then in Habakkuk chapter 2 and verse 22, "The Lord is in His holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before Him." We need to have moments of just silence before God. Sixth, they declare these moments of silence and solitude that God is sufficient. Because all of the to-do list, all of the activity, all of the busyness go away, and just you being there with God is enough. And so much of the disciplines, hasn't that been kind of the point that God is the one who sustains? It's not about what we do or the work that we have, it's what God is doing. The psalmist in Psalm 62, verses 1 and 2, says, "For God alone my soul waits in silence. From Him comes my salvation. He alone is my rock and my salvation, my fortress. I shall not be greatly shaken." It is God alone that is the one that I wait for in silence. And then lastly, spiritual living, it requires it. If we were to be people who are spiritually living, people who are in touch with the work of the Spirit and what God is doing, we must have moments of silence and solitude to recognize that. Paul in Romans chapter 8, verses 5 and 6 says, "For those who live according to the flesh set their minds on things of the flesh, but those who live according to the Spirit set their minds on things of the Spirit." If we are going to reset our minds, it's going to cause us to need to step back and have a moment where we are silent and the noise is gone, a moment where we're alone to be able to think and to reset our minds on who God is. For to set the mind on the flesh is death, but to set the mind on the Spirit is life and peace. And peace is something we don't have nearly enough of most of the time in our lives. Where we come into contact with that, with God, is through silence and through solitude. And back to where we began, without solitude, it is virtually impossible to live a spiritual life. If you find yourself in a place where you don't feel as connected to God as you would like to be, where you don't feel like you're as spiritually focused as you want to be, this may be one of the first really good steps you can take as a follower of Jesus to get there. Can you step away from the busyness of the world? Can you step away from all of the things that are weighing you down? And can you just be silent and alone before God? So some practical steps as we bring this together. And you probably got the first two memorized by now, but we'll say them anyway. First of all, start small. If you struggle with quiet and being alone, don't decide the way you're going to begin this is by doing this for an entire weekend. You are just setting yourself up for failure within that moment. But what you can do is little things. We mentioned in one of the lessons early on, The idea of driving somewhere in your car without turning on the radio, without doing whatever you normally do, and just driving. Not worrying about what the people in front of you are doing, how you're catching every red light across Ada, any of those things. You just silent, alone driving. For most of us, there are times where that is one of the few places we're alone already. So let's make use of that. Secondly, be consistent. Don't let this be a thing you do, and you do it one time and you think, well, that was fine, but I could take or leave that. Jesus didn't do it that way, did he? It wasn't just that moment when he hears the news about John the Baptist. It's over and over and over again throughout the Gospels. Jesus is taking time away, alone, in silence. So be consistent with this. Maybe this is something where you set an alarm on your phone, and there's a time where you do this. Maybe this is something where, because of the nature of life, you live in a house, you have small kids, you have a family to take care of, you have all those things, and it's difficult for you to be alone. Maybe this is you get up 15 minutes earlier, you stay up 15 minutes later. Find times that are regular times you can use and be consistent about it. Third, find a quiet place. Okay, your time of silence and solitude is not buying school supplies at Walmart. I can tell you that from Friday. That's not how this works. But there are places. If you don't have a lot of extra time within your day, and you can take your lunch hour and you can drive out to the park and sit on a bench once it's not 1,000 degrees outside and just enjoy being out there and enjoy the nature that is around, maybe that's it for you. Maybe there's a place that is already a place of silence and solitude for you that you can go and you just associate that place with this. Notice in Scripture how many times we find Jesus going to the Mount of Olives or to the garden or places that are kind of that place for him. Fourth, don't rush. Don't let this be a thing where you know the next appointment is just coming and you're going to have to be there, and so all you can think about in your silence and solitude is the next thing that's coming. Find a way to make this the thing that's happening. Even for Jesus, as he's going away there in Matthew 14, and he does take the time to feed the 5,000, he goes right back to this after it's over. So find a way to do that. And then fifth, listen. And this is what I mean. You will hear people in other religious groups from time to time talk about, God told me to do this, or the Spirit said to do this, or I heard the voice of God and it said. And in churches of Christ where we don't use that kind of language and generally don't have that kind of experience, sometimes we don't know what to do with that. Sometimes we may roll our eyes at it and think, well, that's not real, or I don't even understand how that works. I get that. I don't expect an auditory voice coming to you, but there are times when we slow down and we are quiet and we are alone and we take time to listen, that sometimes the direction in which the Spirit is trying to push us becomes a little more obvious. And sometimes you can see things that you did not see before, notice things you did not notice before. And I believe God, who is all-powerful, has the ability to, if you are tuned in, listening, quiet, alone, to let you know what he wants to let you know. I don't know how to explain that. I don't know what it looks like. But I do know, I know people within churches of Christ who have had an experience a little more like that, where it's not a voice coming from nowhere that no one else heard, but it's just this, somehow. And if we are silent and alone regularly and take that time, I believe you will see that the will that God has for your life sometimes becomes a little more clear to you. Because if you can see him more clearly, and that's a very biblical idea, then you can probably see the things that he wants of you more clearly as well. So this morning, if the idea of silence and solitude, you find yourself thinking, well, that sounds really nice, but I just don't know how that works with where I'm at in life. Let me encourage you to find out how that works where you're at in life. I believe it's for all of us, regardless of where we are. For some, it's more challenging than others, but we can all find those times of silence and solitude. If you have never come to Christ before, you can be baptized into him this morning. You can begin that walk with him. Or if you have found yourself just getting so wrapped up in the manyness and the muchness and the busyness of life and all of the noise around you that you have lost focus on him, let this be a time that you regain that. Let this be a time that you understand the importance of being alone with him in quiet times and quiet places, and value that, to see him more clearly and to know what he wants for your life. If there's some way we can help you this morning, we'll have an elder and his wife in the back, or you can come down here to the front as together we stand and sing.